We are moving now into part two of the lecture. This part of the lecture will look at some of the poetry of Philip Freneau. I'm going to begin here with the Wild Honeysuckle. We have four stanzas. I had to mark one of them over here with a line because it didn't look good the way I did the screenshots of it. We have four stanzas, 6 lines in each of these. These are sexanes. In a sonnet, these are called sestets. Just some more poetic terms that you may not need. But each of these stanzas ends in a couplet. So you see here, the lines are even set off to the side for these couplets, like right here, and then here. Okay, we can see those. All of the lines are in iambic pentameter. Some irregularities, but you could do the beats on that. Da-dun. You might try it. We also have what's called masculine and feminine rhyme. The first two stanzas here and here have what's called masculine or male rhyming couplets. That's single syllable rhyme. Here and tear, goes and repose. The repose O's part here. And over here, Freneau ends with what's called female. And by the way, I didn't gender this poetry. These are old terms. Feminine rhyme, sometimes called double rhyme, where you have two syllables, the first one stressed and the second one unstressed, that actually have perfect rhyme. And here you have to hear the word hour as two syllables for this one to work. Hour and flower. The Wild Honeysuckle poem has a theme running in it of that there's a cycle to life, seasons of life that are symbolic, and that the fair, hidden, untouched flower that is transitory is something that is both common and beautiful. It's the very ephemerality of the flower, like the fact that it disappears so quickly, that makes it beautiful. The flower in this poem could be seen as symbolic, like young America itself, virginal and untouched. Now, remember, that's problematic because America was very much inhabited. But the myth of America has America as something virginal and untouched, much like this flower. The problem again is imperialism and conquering by the whites in America gives us an America that was not untouched whatsoever. The next slide, get rid of my pen tool. Oops, I kind of messed it up there to go to the next slide. I hate that whenever I turn on the pen tool, it messes it up a little bit. So it won't let me escape. There we go. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'll go back into slideshow view for that. I love the pen tool. I don't like what it does to the presentation. With Freneau's poetry, the Wild Honeysuckle, this just has what I spoke. So I'm going to move to the next poem here, the Indian Burying Ground. I scribbled up on this one a little bit. This poem, these are excerpts from it. The main idea he starts with is that we have the dead arranged by the living, and this white man walks up and discovers the scene, the burying ground. This idea of an Indian burying ground very much captured the American imagination of readers at the time. The speaker begins, in spite of all the learned have said, I still my old opinion keep. He's contrasting what he believes with what he's learned from the learned, like the educated that have taught him something. He's rejecting the learning of his own people, and in the poem, recognizing and realizing a superiority of Native American traditions, even over Christian traditions. This line down here, arrows and the head of stone. The arrowheads, having a stone head on the arrowhead, this is a little play on words with like headstones and graveyards. The poem is also a poem written as a commentary on a style of a poem common in British literature, a British graveyard poem. Freneau takes that idea and makes it American. We also see here, I'm going to go over where it says the children of the forest played. We have something I'm going to call the trope of the vanishing Indian. I've mentioned this in class before. We're going to see it many times. The trope of the vanishing Indian is repeated in American literature. It's a common thread that runs through poetry and prose with the idea that Native Americans had just about disappeared. Well, that wasn't true at all. Populations had been displaced and moved. Many had died of disease, but not disappeared, but very much used. This idea of the disappearing or trope of the vanishing Indian was used to romanticize the past. I circled this Sheba illusion here. I thought this was also interesting because it strikes to me a bit of an odd note, like a bad note hit on a piano, to compare the Indian queen in the poem to the biblical Sheba. I did want to point out here that in the copy I snagged from online, I should have used my own copy I gave you to read, but the word reason in the final couplet is not capitalized and should be. Reason here is important. It's inferior to the mystical realm of the Indian dead. There's a lot going on in this poem. Freneau brings together Christian burial traditions with those of Native Americans. There's an intersection there. He's using the Indian figure as a subject. It was already a popular convention in American literature to use the image of the Indian as a signal for American identity. This is really important because authors were using the image of the Indian, put that in quotation marks, to signify some sort of freedom that is particularly American and not British, a signal of difference from the whites, and very much a signal of natural freedom. We keep having this word natural coming up in our readings. The word natural, natural rights, nature, all through this course, we're going to see circling back to nature. Freneau creates an imagined scene in this poem meant to represent something larger in what we might call a native experience. Freneau's Indian here then is not just a symbol or what we might call a noble savage, but something more. More on the noble savage coming up. Right, this slide pulls together some of what I was saying. There's an idealized view of American Indians, homage to a vanishing America, this idea that there's something being lost in America. I mean, of course, that was true. The way that America was when the whites first came, parts of it were changing. The landscape was changing. People were displaced or died of disease, Native Americans. There's a feeling of nostalgia for that American authors tried to capture with the idea of the sentimental Indian or the vanishing Indian trope. You'll see primitiveness celebrated in contrast to Western or European values and the idea of American reason in these poems. I mentioned with the previous slide the idea of the noble savage. This is most often connected to Rousseau. Here's your Jeopardy question. The burial position near the beginning of the poem that Freneau writes about really starts to build this concept in the poem. The context for this is that in the 1820s and 30s, there was a huge population displacement of Native Americans, mostly in the South. You're probably familiar with the term the Trail of Tears. There were brutal policies of uprooting people, paralleled by the rise of the sentimental Indian in American literature. On the right, it's a picture of a dig from an Indian burial mound. There are quite a few of these you can find online. I find these to be interesting because we do have a lot of documentation, but probably so much that isn't documented that has been found in the landscape of this country. I want to turn now to the poem To Sir Toby. We have here Freneau, pulling from his experience in the West Indies, the plantation as hell is introduced here at the very beginning of the poem. I just did some excerpts here, but I wanted to bring up the idea of the lash and the whip that figures in this poem. And also, I wanted to talk about this idea of Cain, because there's a pun here with Cain, Cain in the Bible, the story of Cain and Abel. Cain slew his brother Abel. And there's something called the mark of Cain, because God marked Cain in the Bible. He put a mark on him to show that he had killed his brother, so people would look at him and know he'd done this terrible thing. There has been an interpretation in Western literature by whites that the mark of Cain was actually dark skin, and that the punishment that God put on Cain in the Bible was to make him black. That is an incredible rabbit hole to go down if you want to research that. I do want to focus mostly on the overlap we've had in this class. In Phyllis Wheatley's poem, the last two lines on being brought from Africa to America, she says, "Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." The poem here, Freneau's poem, recounts the pain and suffering of the enslaved, how they were treated like animals, underfed, used for greed and money, and the wealth that is the fruit of slave labor. He even uses the word fruit. Right here, fruits. There's also a reference to iron collars on the women right here that I feel speaks back to some of the images I showed in the Equiano lecture. And I also think this line, pregnant with distress, is interesting because I do think Freneau is bringing us images of raped and pregnant enslaved women. Now, here's an idealized image of cutting the sugar cane in a West Indian plantation. What I think is interesting about this is what we don't see. We don't see the suffering. There's some great overlap here in the selections from Freneau with Thomas Paine. And even the ideas of the Enlightenment from the lecture on the Enlightenment, Paine here in Freneau's depiction of him through poetry is being praised for his righteousness. In this poem, we also have Freneau blaming monarchy for slavery. He references Colombia later in the poem. You don't see it here because this is just an excerpt. But we very much get a sense of Freneau's politics here. And also the concept that Paine was against the divine right of kings to rule, getting back to the idea of Locke's concept of the tabula rasa, that all people are a blank slate and are capable of achieving some sort of superiority. Again, please don't forget that there's a lot of tension between these ideas and the concurrent system of slavery in America at the time. We should take a look before we move to Washington Irving at this poem on the religion of nature. I want you just to think back to the Puritan concept of religion that we looked at just even a few weeks ago. Here, we have natural virtue instead. Nature instilling religion. Hardships are not given by nature. Hardships are something that come instead from the imperfection of mankind. True religion, though, is from nature. And I have this image down here. This is from the Hudson River School of Art, an image of nature as something that is meant to bring religious feeling, awe-inspiring nature. Some of these portraits are in the National Gallery of Art, or the Portrait Gallery in DC. To transition from Freneau to Irving, I have an image here. It's a painting called Falls of the Catterskill by Thomas Cole. It is from that Hudson River School of Painting. It's a romantic view of a forest and a waterfall based on the Catterskill Falls. And there's a little tiny Native American here on this ledge. And so here it is, the trope of the vanishing Indian right here in the painting. Both Freneau and Irving were participating in emergent literary nationalism. They give us perspectives inspired by nature, an emphasis on perception, how people perceive nature around them, how they use their imagination and couple that with the landscape. And they both use imagery of the past and ruins in their writing. Here's another painting from the Hudson River School. Here we see nature again prominent. We see a nice little romantic home. This is called The Home in the Woods. It's another Thomas Cole painting. Why important? Well, to me, this is the kind of scenery that I imagine with Rip Van Winkle. Same with this one, kind of a Rip Van Winkle looking image here as well, with the mountains and a little cottage. These kinds of images usually featured some sort of man-made object that's part of actually their romantic look. I'll get more into that as we move forward. This is the end of part 2, Washington Irving and Philip Freneau, and thanks for watching.